Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, they call them Africa's economic giants, Nigeria and South Africa, accounting for 1/2 of sub-Saharan Africa's GDP and potentially two of the biggest drivers of growth for the region as a whole. But for South Africa, depressing news just emerged, showing that its economy has shrunk by more than half following one of the strictest coronavirus lockdowns in the world. We'll be live in Johannesburg to speak to the South African lecturer and economist Frederich Kirsten. And later, we turn our focus on the Nigerian economy, which, even though it's significantly expanded its economic reforms in recent years, is not only suffering the effects of the pandemic, but is widely recognized to still have a long road ahead in achieving optimum economic expansion and lifting millions of people out of poverty. We'll speak with the respected economist and former Nigerian Minister of Finance, Dr. Kalu Idika Kalu, coming up. Unquestionably, the two big economies of Africa are struggling, overwhelmed by innumerable woes. Nigeria, the continent's most populous nation, is wallowing in and out of recession, and even with a slight rise in oil prices, there is little hope life will improve for ordinary citizens in the near future. But it is South Africa, the industrial giant of the continent, that is beset with not just political tensions, but enormously slow growth that is serving to drastically hold back the country's economic progress. So much so that South Africa's economy has now shrunk by more than half, following one of the strictest coronavirus lockdowns in the world. The contractions means that for the first time since the dawn of democracy in 1993, South Africa's economy has seen 4 consecutive quarters of decline, deepening almost beyond description the country's economic slump. In a moment, we'll be live in Johannesburg to try to understand how it has come to this. But first, here's a cross-section of South Africans reacting to the news of the contraction.
The 51% decline in GDP basically means that in the second quarter of this year, economic activity was about half as much as we saw in the first quarter.
We were in a job loss crisis, we were in a poverty crisis, we were in a landless crisis, and we were in an inequality crisis. These particular figures would have not been as bad as they are had we long time ago restructured the economy away from a colonial posting of extraction of mineral resources and then taking them out of the economy to be beneficiated in mass elsewhere and then come back to South Africa as finished products. We would have been seeing a more robust manufacturing sector.
I think this was at the bad end of our expectations, but obviously it demonstrates just how fundamentally we're going to have to implement structural reform on an urgent and expedited basis if we're going to be able to pivot the trajectory, even in the balance of this year, let alone for 2021 and beyond. And we're very concerned about the impact this is obviously going to have not only on our fiscal deficit, our GDP, debt to GDP ratio, but obviously also on growing levels of unemployment and the risk that that poses even to society in terms of a stable society and a growing economy supporting sustainable employment.
Well, for more on what this huge contraction, 51%, means for the South African economy, I'm joined now from Johannesburg by the economist Frederich Kirsten, who is also a lecturer at the School of Economics at the University of Johannesburg. Really nice to see you, Frederich, and thank you very much indeed for joining us. So a contraction was expected, as I understand it, but even then, these numbers are staggering, aren't they?
Yes, thank you, Charles. It's very interesting. This contraction is quite big, but I think there's a lot of debate in South Africa at the moment on how this contraction should be seen, because the 51% is actually a seasonally adjusted variable. And if you just look at a quarter-to-quarter change, it was only 16.4%. But if you expect it in the next 2 quarters, then it can be 50%. So we must just make a correction there regarding the way South Africa is being contracted. But I think it's still a deep recession South Africa is in at the moment, because 1 quarter retracting by 16.4% is quite big.
Well, absolutely. Although, of course, the numbers being touted is that 51%, which is what is really quite alarming. And I understand that with the exception of agriculture, all sectors of the economy saw big declines, with industries such as aviation, tourism, and hospitality coming to a virtual standstill.
Yes, all of the sectors declined except agriculture, and that's very important to also know that we need to look into these sectors to see exactly what job losses might occur in these sectors due to the contraction. And there's a lot of studies in South Africa pointing to the fact that low-skilled jobs are going to be the ones that's going to lose the most. And if we lose these low-skilled jobs, we're actually then adding to South Africa's socioeconomic issues of high poverty and high inequality. So that's very problematic. But yes, agriculture was the only one who increased, and the mining sector and also construction decreased significantly, and trade was halted. So it was a very significant time period for South Africa, and these restrictions really, we saw it in the consumer demand going down by a significant amount.
Well, yes. I mean, you mentioned consumer demand going down. That controversial ban on alcohol and cigarettes, I suppose, contributed quite a lot to the contraction, didn't it? I mean, I understand consumer spending on those items fell by something like a massive 92%.
Yes, it was quite bad for those banned items, but even items like things that people spent mostly their money on before the lockdown fell dramatically. And that was also a big issue, like hotel spending, retail fell, and also restaurants. And these were key indicators or key industries for South Africa in creating jobs. And this is one of the big issues at the moment, is the job losses being suffered by these industries retracting or contracting. And that is the big issue. But yes, the tobacco ban and alcohol ban did result in a significant drop in consumer demand. But still, South Africa is not yet picking up to what it should be, because consumer demand is still sluggish to return to its normal heights from 2019.
And Frederich, just explain to us why agriculture seems to have escaped the impact of this decline, I mean, as opposed to the other sectors of the economy.
So there was just in the agricultural sector, there was a higher demand for citrus fruit and pecan nuts and also maize exports. So that was where everything picked up. So that is where the agricultural sector gained during this time period. But we also see the communication sector also increased due to this working from home condition that people had to adjust to, and thus communication also increased in South Africa. So that sector also expanded, but agriculture was due to these external forces like an increase in the citrus fruit exports and maize exports.
And just trying to get our heads around the reason for this very big contraction. I mean, obviously a lot of it being attributed to the sort of harsh and rapid, lockdown. But I mean, I'm assuming that, the fact that the economy itself was already in a weak position before the coronavirus set in also played a significant part.
Yes, I think South Africa's economy was struggling even before this lockdown. And what we saw in the South African economy is large poverty rates, but also a very struggling middle class. And recent reports have shown that South Africa's middle class could actually contract by 34%. And this middle class can actually then become more vulnerable to poverty and move back into poverty. And this is very alarming for South Africa, because your middle class is normally your backbone behind economic growth, political stability, and increasing your spending in the country. So it's very important for South Africa to support the middle class and to put policies in place to support this middle class, which have also suffered due to the restrictions and job losses.
And when you say it's very important to support the middle class, that suggests that the middle class isn't being supported.
Well, yes, in South Africa, there's also the notion of the missing middle class and how this missing middle class has come about. And it's almost seen as the new inequality divide in South Africa, where the middle class wage has actually decreased or has not grown as much as the elite and the lower classes. So in South Africa, this has been reported. And in the last 20 years, we've seen inequality in South Africa actually increase. While poverty has been reduced by some margin, inequality has actually been on the rise in South Africa, which is alarming given the policies in place to reduce it.
Well, just explain that to us, because obviously we're not in South Africa and we've got a very big global audience trying to get their heads around what is going on there. When you talk about inequality increasing but poverty decreasing, how does that work?
So we looked at the wage growth of the distribution of the people in South Africa. And what we see over the last 20 years, due to minimum wage policies and so on, the lower class, the people earning a lot less, their wages have increased due to the minimum wage regulations. And then also the elitist class also show increase in their wage growth. But it is in the middle class that we see a stagnant wage growth. So they haven't grown as much as the lower class and the elite class. And this shows us that it's actually creating this missing middle, where the middle class is missing out on wage growth. And we also see the semi-skilled workers losing their jobs and so on, more than low-skilled and high-skilled workers, which is also semi-skilled is a middle-class occupation.
So, in fact, a myriad of problems, some of them structural, some of them driven by policy, and that just suggests that things are going to get worse before they get better. And I mean, here, of course, you have this coronavirus pandemic. Is it fair to say that South Africa is paying a heavy price for its early and aggressive lockdown?
Well, the lockdown was put in place in order to protect people's lives. And what we see now is we need to start thinking about how the economy is going to recover. I think a lot of the talk in South Africa at the moment is not whether the lockdown has worked or not, but how we can recover now and the policies that's going to be put in place to recover. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has also fastened this process in South Africa, that we need to address inequality and poverty quickly. We need reforms in our policies in order to address this very quickly, because we are, like we said, we struggled even before the COVID-19 crisis, but I think COVID-19 has just highlighted this for us, and policy reforms are desperately needed in order to drive the economy forward, because there is a lot of potential still left in the economy if it's driven with the correct policies.
So, I mean, Frederich, just to be clear, while that lockdown strategy is on the one hand credited with controlling the spread of the pandemic, on the other, with the South African economy already in stagnation, that economy has been hit very hard indeed.
Yes, that is true. So there's a lot of debate of whether the lockdown restrictions were too harsh given the South Africa's economy and how it was faring even before the COVID-19 crisis. But again, that is now history. So we need to start thinking about our recovery and how we're going to get, because South Africa started now reducing the lockdown restrictions. And we see now, again, tourism being, domestic tourism increasing, hotels and restaurants spending increasing, but it's still very sluggish. So South Africa needs to start put policies in place so we can start picking up this consumer demand, so we can actually get back to our 2019 state and then move on to actually a better situation of economic growth.
And I mean, you talk about policies there. As the sparks continue to fly, I mean, sparks which obviously can't be good for business. I mean, what sort of noises are you hearing from the government by way of reassurance?
So our President Cyril Ramaphosa has announced that we're going to put policies in place in order for the recovery, and it's all based on the employment schemes that's going to be put in place, also some tax relief, and we see a lot of more policies that will come forth in the next month or so on how to attract foreign investment and have some investment in infrastructure in South Africa, because there's a great need for this infrastructure investment, and it's also this cohesion between the private and the public sector to move together and try to solve this economic crisis in South Africa.
I mean, how uncertain would you say the future looks right now for South Africa, and how much does that uncertainty translate into the mood on the streets of Johannesburg where you are?
So I think at the moment COVID-19 is still very much at large and still part of our lives, and I think that is also one of the reasons why consumer spending is not picking up, but people are still uncertain about their jobs, and given this uncertainty they then don't spend money, and spending money is what we need in the economy to grow the economy again. So I think that's it's almost a catch-22 situation at the moment, and I think we need to think about how we can create an environment where people feel more certain about a future and more stable about jobs, and then they can actually spend more money in the economy, which will then pick up South Africa's economy to where it needs to go. But at the moment, we still see a lot of uncertainty on the streets, given job losses and the health risk of COVID-19 and so on.
Well, I mean, the problem, of course, for South Africa is that that feeling of uncertainty is not limited to just sort of ordinary people walking on the streets. I mean, I understand that many businesses are actually considering leaving South Africa. How much does that potentially create a problem for both tax revenue and jobs, which of course would potentially deepen the economic problems in South Africa?
Yes, that is very important, because that is where our growth lies as a country. We need to make sure we attract business to South Africa and even keep the existing business here. And I think that is where we need to create this environment. So it's not just people on the streets, it's people outside in the business that actually feel this uncertainty in South Africa at the moment. And I think reassuring with policy and reforms will actually drive a lot of business confidence up again in South Africa. So the policy reforms and structuring the policy correctly is very important for allowing this environment where business will feel there is profit to be made and there is a venture worth pursuing in South Africa, and then joining hands with the public sector in order to expand the economy. So that is, I think, the main aim for South Africa at the moment.
Well, I'm just wondering what the biggest constraint to business in South Africa today is, apart from the coronavirus. I mean, we're told that the biggest constraint is the untidiness of South Africa's domestic political arrangements. Do you agree with that assessment?
So yes, so there is the thing that constrains business the most is this, the political stability, and I think political instability is a big factor, and I think political stability can really drive your economy forward, and it can actually create a sense of business confidence again. So there is this political instability sometimes in the country, but I think there is still a good structure there, and we need some physical space also. The government needs to address its debt issues, which is also one of the reasons why business is not coming in maybe as they should be coming in. And I think this physical space and this government changing their perception on debt and addressing the debt issues will take a long way into actually moving forward and also creating business confidence that will attract investment in the country. So yes.
Now, recently, South Africa avoided a downgrade to so-called junk status by the ratings agency Standard & Poor's. I mean, what's happened to the country's credit rating now with this enormous contraction and the adverse implications of the coronavirus pandemic?
Yes, there's a lot of uncertainty, and that's again the uncertainty of what this figure means for South Africa. Like I said, the 51% should not be taken as South Africa's economy has been halved, but rather it's contracted by around 16.4%. But still, it's a very deep recession South Africa is in, and there's a lot of uncertainty about where this is going to go in terms of the rating agencies. Our interest rates will probably have to be reduced, maybe even further. So there's a lot of talk of what is going to be the immediate future, but then also the long-term recovery, because a lot of people are seeing this recovery in South Africa to be 2 to 3 years in order just to get back to our original point of 2019 and then to move forward, because 2019 was not as good as we want it to be. We will actually want to grow around 3 to 5%.
Well, I notice you're being a little bit sort of soft on the issue of government policies and so on. And I'm not trying to kind of push you into anything overtly controversial, but you are, of course, an economist. You're a lecturer at the university. You've got your ear to the ground and you're keeping track of the figures and the numbers and the reactions to those figures and the numbers, as well as the mood in the business climate and amongst ordinary people. I mean, are you reassured that from the government side of things and amid the political battle lines that are drawn across South Africa, are you convinced that proper policy making is getting done? Because, I mean, we've heard complaints about that as well.
Yes, I am an optimistic economist, so that's how I see it. And the thing is, I do believe there's the policy structures in place. I think the reforms of the policy is important. South Africa has had various policies in the past, redistribution policies and so on, and these have not really assisted the inequality in South Africa, and there needs to be a reform in the policies also to address these issues like inequality. And then also we need to focus on where we can actually find our strength, and I feel that the government is moving in the right direction in terms of an alignment between the private and public sector. But that alignment between them and that relationship is key to South Africa's growth. And the president has also spoken about everybody in South Africa needing to take up arms against the fight against inequality and poverty. And I think that is the way to go. But I think implementing that is very important, and the way it's being implemented. And maybe we haven't been successful in the past, but I think we can going forward, given the COVID-19 crisis has actually left us no choice but to reform our policies and to move into the right direction.
Well, Frederich, I hate to ruin your optimism there, but the South African economy is also beset by allegations of corruption and mismanagement. I mean, does that mean that it is less likely to snap back to any sort of health? I mean, is there a sense that those who make policy and officials in charge of the economy have both hands on the steering wheel or not?
Well, that is also something that has come forth now, the corruption claims and during the lockdown. And I think that's also something that's being addressed given the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it's come a long time, and I think South Africa is finally taking a stance against corruption, as mentioned by our president. And I think that's very important. And this stance against corruption is very important for also to attract new investment into the country. Because as soon as you take the stand against corruption and you sort it out in your country, then you can actually move forward, because then people see how serious you are in terms of accounting for it or reducing it. And I know it is part of South Africa in a moment, and I think it's something that at least we're taking a stance now on and actually addressing so we can move forward.
Frederich, I want to thank you very much indeed for your insights into the latest economic developments in South Africa. Frederich Kirsten is a lecturer, he's an economist, he's a lecturer at the School of Economics at the University of Johannesburg. Now, beyond slow economic growth, South Africa is also, as you heard, beset by political tensions, which can't be good for the country's ailing economy. You might have heard that the South African health and beauty store Clicks has been granted a court order to stop an opposition party intimidating its staff and customers. The retailer was forced to close more than 400 outlets on Monday following protests about a hair advert that was described as racist. Clicks published the advert on its own website, which described black hair as damaged, dry and frizzy, and white hair as normal and good. The violent protest that followed affected more than 100 branches of the health and beauty retailer. At least 2 stores were petrol bombed, while others were vandalized and prevented from opening. But now the High Court in Johannesburg has prohibited the opposition party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, and those acting on its instructions from intimidating or threatening staff and customers.